In this movie, we'll take a look at the log files Rails uses, learn how to configure them, and how to write your own information to them. Note that the log files I'm referring to here are the Rails application logs, which are very different from the log files that the web server uses. Errors that occur before a request gets to your application, and errors regarding startup and communicating with your application will show up in the server logs. But the web server only knows about the requests that come in and the data that it sends back. Everything that happens once it passes off that request to the application remains a mystery to it. But the Rails log files can provide lots of detail about what happens as Rails processes the request. The kind of information that gets logged can be configured and can be different for each of your environments. As we saw in the last movie, by default, development is set to the debug log level. The production environment is going to be set by default to the info log level. You can change these to a few other choices. Let's go over them so we understand the differences. There are 5 options: debug, info, warn, error, and fatal. Debug shows you everything. Shows you the errors, the deprecations, the details about the templates that get rendered, all of the request details, including the parameters that were sent, and it even shows you the SQL that it composes. So you can view the actual SQL that it writes and work to optimize it. That's appropriate during development, and that's why it's the default. Now the default during production is info. Info shows you all of those same things, but it leaves off the SQL queries. That's a good thing. It doesn't fill up your production log file as quickly, and it also doesn't expose any sensitive database information in that log file. It is still, however, pretty chatty because every single request that comes into the web server gets logged. It logs the request and all the details about rendering. The next option is warn, and I think that's a better option personally for production because it leaves off those request details and render details and only shows you when things go wrong and the deprecations. So it's up to you whether you want to log every single bit of activity that comes into the server or only when things go wrong. The last 2 options aren't really that different from warning. Error and fatal don't show you the deprecations, and the difference between error and fatal is that error shows you recoverable errors and fatal shows you only the show-stopping errors, the things that really it couldn't recover from. Now in practice, most of the time you would just want to set it to warn, and that would take care of all of those. There's not enough difference between warning, error, and fatal, but it is important still to understand that there is a difference there. Now in addition to configuring each environment and deciding what things ought to get logged, we also have the ability to use these log levels to log to the logger ourselves. And the place to do that is going to be from your controller. That's where you're going to do the logging. And the way you do it is by saying logger dot and then whatever log level you want to log, and then a string for what should get logged. And you can put whatever you want into that string. So I've given you a couple of examples that we might use. Logger.debug. I've put something in there just to expose a value to me, just so that I can look in my log and see, oh, okay, at this point in the code, this was the value of something. Logger.info, I might use to let myself, oh, look, you're starting a process here. Logger.warn, we might want to use for something like warning us that someone tried to log in with an invalid password. Logger.error, that a permalink for a page wasn't found. And maybe logger.fatal might be used if we weren't able to successfully load up a module or a plugin that we needed and we couldn't recover from that error. So it's really up to you as to how you use these. Just keep in mind at what level you're logging and which configuration option would allow it to be seen. Now I'd like to try all these out and play with the different log levels, but before we do, I first want us to talk a little bit more about deprecations because I want us to be able to see those as well. Deprecations are code that works now, but which has been scheduled to stop working in a future version. Now deprecations are mostly used by the Rails framework, but you can actually write your own deprecations as well. To see a deprecation in Rails version 3.0, a good example is Form4. Form4 used to use an ERB tag that did not have the equal sign with it. Now it does. And I think that's an improvement because it actually is doing some output. So the equal sign helps to show that. So the non-equal sign version still works, but you'll get a deprecation warning. And that lets us know that it will stop working altogether at some future version of Rails. We don't know for sure when, but it will be deprecated. So we need to start using the other syntax. Now I can tell you how to see a deprecation now, such as this one, but once a new version of Rails comes out, the deprecations are going to change, and this may no longer be deprecated. It may actually get removed at that point, and there'll be a new set of deprecations. So one way that we can make sure that we can see a deprecation and use it ourselves is that we can create our own. And we do that with active support : deprecation, and we call that class and say issue a warning, this is a deprecation, and then whatever string we want to indicate that this is deprecated code. So we can use it to play with, to see the errors and see how they work. We can also use this exact same code in your application whenever you decide to deprecate something. So let's try these out. So in order to do these, I'm going to go into my demo controller again, and I'm just going to create another method here, paste it in, called logging. And the first thing I'm going to do is just generate some SQL, just an SQL query so we can see that pop up in the log levels. Then I've got a deprecation warning here that I've added in. And then I've got a logger entry at each of the different levels, from debug all the way to fatal. And in the end, I'll just render text so that I don't have to have a template. So let's try this out. Right now, config, environments, development, my log level is set to debug for my development environment. And that's the default if I hadn't specified anything here. So let's go into the terminal, Rails server from the root of my application. Now let's open up Firefox, local host 3000, demo, and then logging. So there it is. I get logged. Now if we come over here and we take a look at our log file, inside log, inside development log, you'll see that it logged everything. It shows me information about the request. It shows me the SQL that it ran. It shows me my deprecation warning. And it shows me all 5 of my different log messages. Now if we change that, let's instead make it warn, just so we can see the difference. So I'll save that. We need to restart our web server. It's very important so that it reloads that configuration. That doesn't happen automatically. Now it'll load with that new setting in place. Let's go back and just reload the page here. Come back to development log. And just so it's clear, this is where the old one ended, line 14. And this is what it logged this time. So it didn't log anything about the request. It didn't log the SQL. It did log the deprecation warning. And we're only seeing the 3 of the 5 log messages. So feel free to play around with those levels and get used to the difference between them. I'm going to go back to development. And I'm just going to change this back to debug, just so that that stays in the right place. There's one more thing I want to show you, which is that from the command line, stop the web server, we can issue a command rake log singular clear. And that will clear all of our logs out. That includes not just the development log, but also the production server and test log. So that's a nice simple way. Once you've been developing for a while, your log files have started to fill up, you can just clear out those logs, shrink the file size, and make it easier to find the new log entries. There's one more topic that I want us to cover here, which is if we go into environments, into the production configuration. So this is the configuration for when our application is in production. If we scroll down, we'll see here we have config log level debug. Default is info. So if we don't do anything, it'll be info. Now let's think about what info will log in production. It will log all of the request parameters that come in. Why does that matter? Well, we spent a lot of energy encrypting our passwords so that those passwords would not be stored anywhere in plain text. But if someone tries to log into our application, guess what? A log entry would be created in our production log, logging that password in plain text. That's a huge security problem. Well, there's 2 solutions to it. The first is that we can just not log that activity. So I can set this to warn. And I think that's a good practice anyway, so that's what I'm going to do. But even better is that in Rails, in config application.rb, by default, down at the bottom of the file, there is a configuration for which parameters ought to be filtered before logging. This will make sure that these never show up there. This entry is in there by default, but I want you to know about it so that you know that it's happening and you know what it's doing. Any parameter that gets submitted that has password in the name, anywhere, whether it's password, password confirmation, old password, new password, hashed password, any of those, if it finds a regular expression for password, then it's going to replace that value with filtered in our log files. And that will make sure that it doesn't show up there. That's it. It's that easy. Anything with password will get filtered. If you need something else filtered out, then you can just add it here. Chances are this is probably enough to accommodate you. And again, it's those sensible defaults that are built into Rails so that you don't even have to think about it. Now I'll finish this movie by telling you a funny but true story. I was planning on showing you a different method of filtering out the parameters like password by entering something into the controller. But it turns out that when I went to try it, I got a deprecation notice letting me know that it had been deprecated and reminding me that it had been changed to putting it here. I actually had known that that change happened, but I'd forgotten about it when I was putting this together. So you can see how those deprecation warnings do come in very handy.